A good friend of mine is with a very well-known publishing company and told me this story. And it's somebody our viewers would know who told me this story. Somebody had pitched a book or had written a book about a woman in, I think it was the 1920s, 1930s, who wanted to be a surgeon in America and felt she had to go as a man. She had to portray herself as trans, right? Nobody knew that she was actually a woman. She wasn't trans. She just had to pretend she was a man because you couldn't get into medical school back then as a woman. So she did. She cross-dressed as a man and she passed as a man, and she had a very successful
so
career.
This is a novel based upon an actual person, the historical fiction.
Yeah. So it's not really a novel; it's nonfiction.
Yeah.
I think it was either nonfiction or it was a novel based on real life.
Right.
And so she had a very successful career posing as a man, as a surgeon. And then when she died, it came out, right? And now this was a look at this woman's life. So the editor at the publishing house said, "This is a great story, and we definitely want to publish this book," and ran it by a couple, the young editors at this publishing house. And they were deeply offended because the woman didn't own being trans. She was basically a poser trans. She wasn't a real trans person. She was a fake trans person. And they found it very deeply offensive to actual trans people. And so the editor said, maybe I'm just dealing with two lunatics here. I'm going to open this up to a wider group of people, and had a greater group of young editors read it. And their response was to get him in trouble for forcing them to read such an openly bigoted manuscript. Needless to say, the book did not make it. And I don't know what ultimately happened with it, but that's the situation these more reasonable, older school people are in right now. You don't know what landmines you're about to step on.
So that's the second aspect of what I call successor ideology. First of it is we have to know your identity so that we can discriminate against or for you. Second is
against or for you. I like that.
Right.
Okay, that's
the
good.
basis of censorship is this idea of emotional harm and trauma, right? And this is something where they got him in trouble on the basis of employment law that has to do with harassment, right? And so you have this existing legal toolkit, and you use it. You code your claims to say that, like, this makes me feel unsafe. There's specific legal language that you use when you make these claims, but that legal language that is kind of, in many cases, like used as a weapon, also penetrates people's souls and makes it so that they really are vulnerable at this level, right? And so, like, you were taught to read things as if your emotional well-being is on the line at all times, in part because if you get offended, you can then use this as a weapon to destroy your enemies. But like that habit of reading actually like penetrates your emotions so that you actually are like emotionally traumatized and harmed. So it seems like there is this kind of law of conservation of oppression, right? Like as people have like less and less to actually be less and less likely to encounter sort of overt expressions of prejudice as these things become utterly taboo on the basis of social death. There is this increased sensitivity, to the microaggression, right? And those who sort of experienced actual legalized systemic discrimination simply were not in a position where they could feel, right, the sting of the microaggression. And so you have all these reports, right, in New York Times, where they go on hunts for oppression and they report them breathlessly. And in order to do their reporting, they interview a lot of people and they come up with the best thing they can come up with, right? Like they print the most damning thing that is fit to print, right? And so after the great sort of racial reckoning at Condé Nast, there was an example where there was an editor, I think, of Bon Appetit, right? And what did he do? In 2004, he wore a costume that was seen as making reference to Latinx identity, right? And that was seen as like an act of, and of course, like you don't lose your job simply because somebody has something. You lose it because like other people dislike you, have agendas against you, and you can't marshal a coalition on your behalf.
Tell me about it.
they did a wider piece about all the problematic things that happen. And the example that they show was an editor at another magazine had a black assistant, and he gave her a copy of the book The Element of Style, right, by E.B. White, which is like the standard.
We all have to read it.
Standard guide. She was offended by it and took it to mean as a racial microaggression, suggesting, right, that like she needed to improve her work, which A, it doesn't necessarily mean that. B, your editor, right, his job is to get you to be better at your work, right? Like that is within his area of competency. And there's really no reason to think that it is a microaggression of any kind, racial or otherwise. What's revealing about it is that it made the cut, right? Because if they had anything better, right, like it would have been front and center. Better thing. There's actually nothing there. There's just a person who has been schooled to take offense, to believe that nothing has changed, to believe that this thing that happened to her is the moral equivalent of Jim Crow, and that the same degree of umbrage is merited, and above all, that like there will be people within the culture who's going to just take it at face value, right? There will be people in the culture who present that to you and expect you to nod your head sagely and piously and be like, oh my God, like what was done to this person? And so it's going back to this thing, like, I wrote an essay, sort of about sort of Asian American male rage, right? And it has to do with the kind of like emasculation of the Asian American male, which is a trope within Asian American study, but it's also like a part of the experiences of Asian Americans. There was a study that was done by, the Freakonomics guy, Stephen Dubner, I guess. And, he looked at online dating and he reached the conclusion that an Asian American male, in order to be on parity with his otherwise similar white counterpart in terms of the amount of responses that he would get, would need to make $367,000 more a year, right, to like be seen as on parity.
Oh my God, this is like the SAT. I read that you did an article about this, right? The Asians had to score higher in order to get in.
They score 300 points higher. 300 points higher than the otherwise equivalent white white candidate, and then 420 points higher than the otherwise equivalent black candidate, right? Crazy. And so, or 120
so
points
higher.
So
the same is true in online dating. The Asian men really have a lot of very high hoops to jump through to get the
so
same
it's like, look, we have this statistics-based account of systemic problems, right? And like, I don't look that study. I'm sure you can kind of poke methodological holes in it and so on, but I don't think any Asian American man who's been on an online dating app will dispute that like it is documenting to some degree something that is real, right? And
can I just ask, even if the women on there are Asian, are Asian women putting Asian men in this position as well?
OkCupid actually found that there was a stronger white male bias among Asian American women who are on the site, right? So that's a self-selecting group, but like those who are using online dating, right? Like this, so like this is all a part of the same thing. We have all this kind of like data-based and race-based information where we're able to look at disparities between people that document what people feel to be real, right? Disparities that aren't captured by, and that you can't legislate out of existence, right? Like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 said but like there are all of these things that exist in people's minds that you can't legislate out of existence. My only response, though, is like the right answer is not the one that we have chosen, which is to kind of make it so that an accusation as dumb as giving me the elements of style is a racial microaggression, right? And that's inevitably what happens when you kind of remove any idea of like proportionality, and you sort of put ideas of due process into, and then you just create this kind of fantasy world, as you know, right, where you can be punished for saying something is true, and you can be punished for denying something that is false, right? Like, this is not the answer, right?